I'm here today in Shrewsbury or Shrewsbury Cemetary, depending on how you choose to pronounce the name of this town. And I'm looking for the grave of Arthur Poole. Next to his grave there should also be a memorial. Now, Arthur Poole was the first Church of England bishop in Japan. Maybe the first Anglican bishop, I'll need to check that. But he was born in Shrewsbury and died here in Shrewsbury and is so buried here. And I thought it would be an interesting video to make. So we'll have a little wander around and see if we can find it. Yeah. So Shrewsbury Cemetery is quite a large cemetery, and so we know that Arthur Poole was buried in 1885, and so some nice people visiting their graves here directed us to the older part of the cemetery. Now the problem is we have this grave is 1899 and there's a 1964 one nearby. And generally this seems to be older graves. So herein we would hope to find Arthur Poole's grave with the modern memorial plaque near it. And that's what I'm trying to do. I've seen pictures. I know the general shape and layout, but it's hard to find currently. So I'm here at the grave of Arthur William Poole in Shrewsbury Cemetery. I found it with the help of groundskeepers and a few calls to the office. It's a bit difficult to find, but it's plot 43, grave 14A. So we have a memorial on the left, the tombstone here on the right. So in this grave there are numerous members of the Poole family, and we're primarily interested in Arthur William Poole, who died in 1885. Slightly lower down on the list you can see Jane Poole, who was his wife, died in 1894, and his father, Thomas Francis Poole, who also died in 1894. Now, Arthur William Poole was born in 1852, I believe. So he died when he was in his early 30s. Now, despite being young, he has had a place in Japanese history, and one which I find interesting, at least. And some of that story is told on the memorial next to his grave, which is here. So this memorial was established by Poole Gakuin, which is a university in Osaka, and this was built in 2009. The school itself was established in 1879. So this was built on the 130th anniversary of the school. Now the school is named after Poole Gakuin. Right? So Poole himself was the first bishop of the Church of England in Japan. He was educated here in Shrewsbury, at Shrewsbury School, and then he went to Oxford University, Worcester College, and after graduating he became a missionary for the Church Mission Society and moved to India. And he was one of the only candidates that the multiple Anglican mission societies could agree upon to be a bishop in Japan, and as such he became the first Church of England bishop in Japan. Now remember, so he became bishop 1883 and served until his death in 1885. He was a very sickly fellow, so he died young and did not serve in the position long. So I'm here at the University of Birmingham this morning, and I just thought I'd continue making the video that I started at Shrewsbury Cemetary on Arthur Poole. So here at the University of Birmingham there is a library, or a series of archives called the Cadbury Research Library Special Collections, which is in that building in the front right, I guess in the middle of this shot currently. And within the collections they hold the Church Mission Society archives, and within there are the personal papers, diary, and other items pertaining to the life of Bishop Poole. So I've been using those archives after having gone to the grave a few weeks ago, and I just thought I would update slightly on... Sorry, there's a squirrel. On what I've learned about Bishop Poole's life. So Bishop Poole only served in Japan for, well, less than a year. He went out in late 1883, I believe, and after going out he became ill, and his diary abruptly ends in July and then picks back up again in October of that year with an explanation that he had some sort of lung disease. And so he proceeds from Japan to California, where he spends several months before finally going back to the UK. And that happens in late 1884. And then he dies in mid-1885. Now, Poole had already retired from CMS earlier due to illness. At that time he was based in South India, but he retired, went back to the UK, still working as a priest, and meanwhile, behind the scenes, CMS and SPG, which are two missionary societies, were discussing the possibility of, so it's very cold this morning, of having a jointly appointed bishop for the Church of England in Japan. And they'd been discussing this for several years, and the only person that they could agree upon was Bishop Poole, and that's how his nomination came about. My memory's hazy on this point, but perhaps I think I'm right in saying that he was the 8th CMS bishop, so he's one of the early ones. And I've lost my train of thought. Well, in any case, he was one of the early bishops. I remember my thought now. So his nomination was not particularly popular. There are letters of support, but there is a large collection of letters within the archives which are against the appointment of a bishop in Japan. Now, this doesn't have anything to do with Poole specifically, but more has to do with the fact that the missionary societies had to pay, had to keep the upkeep of their bishop, or bishops, I should say, and there was a large number of complaints about this. Not many people wanted to pay the £500 a year stipend. Obviously one person wouldn't be paying the whole 500, but didn't want to contribute to this £500 stipend that Poole would be given. Now, due to the very short time he was present in Japan, most history books that deal with him, and they deal with him very briefly, note that he didn't particularly have a large impact on Japanese Christianity or Japanese history in general. Now, that's to some extent true, but his obituaries, the other documents which we find in his archives, point to a man who was well liked and was having an impact, at least contemporaneously. Now, he's also significant as the first Church of England bishop in Japan. Now, Christianity at the time is still relatively in its infancy. After Catholicism was banned in the early 17th century, the first Protestant missionaries to come started arriving in the 1850s and 1860s, and as you can probably tell, as he became bishop in the early 1880s, it took a while to establish a hierarchy for the church. But they did so, and Poole was the first to head the Church of England's hierarchy.